Okay, so my presentation is going to be basically a summary of a recently published work in the Review of Geophysics. The title is Hydraulic Fracture-Induced Seismicity. This was a collective effort led by Ryan Schultz, now at Stanford. Just really wanted to give folks a chance to sort of learn a little bit more about what's in that study and hopefully encourage folks to take a closer look at it. Okay, so I did want to provide a sort of an overview here globally as to sort of what went into our paper. And so trying to document, there is a global distribution now of documented hydraulic fracture-induced seismicity. You can see many of these cases are focused in North America, those here in the US as well as Canada, but cases from the UK and China are included in this review as well. I did also want to touch on what's shown here is the maximum magnitude in each of these cases. And I did want to note that we've got cases in both British Columbia and Alberta, Canada, that are in excess of magnitude 4. The cases in the US have generally been 4.0 and less. In the UK, it's just below a 3, and then cases up into the magnitude 5 range in China. So certainly the largest magnitude events have been observed in China, but you can see considerable sizes here in North America as well. I also wanted to kind of review a bit about the activity of hydraulic fracture wells. So there has been considerable proliferation in the number of hydraulic fracture wells. We tried to show the number of wells over the past 7 years through different areas in North America where we had access to the hydraulic fracture well databases. And you can see here the Delaware Basin, West Texas has the largest number. You can see British Columbia here, one of the smaller numbers. But I wanted to just note that the number of wells is not well tied to the maximum magnitude of events, right? That the largest that we have seen thus far is in British Columbia. That's certainly one of the lower ones. And so, again, just trying to communicate that just because there are more wells doesn't necessarily mean you get larger size events. In fact, I also wanted to touch on that we included the Williston Basin in here as well. That's sort of moderate in terms of number of wells, but has not had any documented hydraulic fracture-induced seismicity. Again, just because you have a lot of wells doesn't necessarily mean you would experience this type of seismicity. Our paper goes into many case studies. It's really an excellent way to get a quick review of what's been seen in different areas. So that's part of the reason I encourage folks to have a look. But I did want to touch on one that's newer, so folks may not have heard a whole lot about. Also, West Texas is an area that has been seeing pretty dramatic increases in the amount of seismicity over the past few years. I wanted to note that some of that seismicity has been well documented to be related to hydraulic fracture activity. You can see a zoomed in map here showing the trajectory of the hydraulic fracture wells, the well laterals, and you can see the seismicity is close in space, as well as the timing of the hydraulic fracture stimulations correlate very well with the timing of seismicity. So a pretty clear sort of correlation in some cases, but there is a fair amount of that seismicity that's not sort of closely tied to hydraulic fracturing. We do envision that seismicity is essentially related to wastewater disposal, but unraveling those two effects and whether or not things like extraction are playing a role is still the subject of future work. But I would encourage folks to have a look at our paper from earlier this year, trying to look at this in some detail. All right, there are a number of common themes that I wanted to sort of touch on that we go over in our review paper. One of those is just how common it is to see repetitive waveforms that we're showing 4 families of events, if you will, in this figure here with cross-correlation coefficients in excess of 80%. You can see, the similarities in the small wiggles, how they match the sort of average wiggle. It's a wiggle for wiggle similarity here. And we believe this is related to spatial clustering, that in essence, the coda of the seismogram here comes from the path that it takes through the Earth. And so the reverberations are similar because the source zone and the station are similar. So we don't believe at this point that the earthquakes are all occurring on the same patch of the fault, but that they are occurring in close proximity, that the influence of injection is adjusting the properties in a small area of the fault. All right. We also find commonly that the earthquakes are occurring as swarms. And so in that sense, it's also temporal clustering that we're seeing clustering events in time associated with the injection. And again, related, we think, to the effects of injection. I also wanted to touch on that what happens in terms of when earthquakes are occurring relative to the hydraulic fracture stimulation, right? So this graph is a histogram, number of cases, and then it's showing the fraction of events that occur during stimulation. So you can see the sort of average over all the cases is a little greater than 90% of the seismicity occurring during stimulation. But you do see there are a number of cases that are occurring with seismicity less than 90%. In fact, even in some cases, as much as 50% is occurring after the completion of the injection at the well lateral. So, again, some physical mechanisms are necessary to sort of explain why is this occurring. One of the hypotheses is that the injection itself is generating, and the earthquakes associated with the injection are generating stress changes that can lead to events afterwards. We're also noting that some of the larger events have occurred after the completion is done. So trying to better understand that is an area of interest. We did note there are several challenges in looking at hydraulic fracture-induced seismicity. One of those is just consistent detection of seismic events. We are seeing that with variable styles of seismic networks and variable and recording over time, that makes it somewhat hard to compare from place to place. So a more uniform strategy, I mean, in some cases there are microseismic data available, and so that can make it a lot easier to see what's going on. We also note that there is some difficulty in associating earthquakes with hydraulic fracturing. In some cases, it's very clear, the space and time relationship, the lack of other operational activities can make it quite clear. But then in other cases, like I mentioned in West Texas, where we've got multiple things going on at the same time, it can be a little bit harder to identify which earthquakes are primarily triggered by hydraulic fracturing, or in some cases, what proportion of the influence of hydraulic fracture injection is causing the seismicity. What are the relative contributions of different operational effects? I also wanted to note that there are some limitations in the hydraulic fracture reporting in the sense that we have limitations in terms of what's available over time and space. Databases like FracFocus have been useful to try and identify when and where hydraulic fracturing is occurring, but they're still limited in that we don't know individual stages. We often don't know the details of what's being injected, pressures and things like that. So that certainly has been a limitation. I did also want to touch on the physical mechanisms that we envision are happening to cause hydraulic fracture-induced seismicity. The primary one that has been sort of for years for injection-induced seismicity is that when the injection is occurring, it's connecting with a fault that then the fluid pressures are influencing the pore pressure on the seismogenic portion of the fault and bringing it closer to failure. So this is a sort of longstanding hypothesis on how this seismicity is occurring. We've seen some increased attention to what I would refer to as the poroelastic effect, where changes in the poroelastic stress near the fault zone can then sort of propagate stress out towards a fault at some distance. So there may not be a true conduit for the pore fluid pressures to influence that fault, but instead stress is transmitted through the rock layers. Last one that has become a newer sort of area of interest is perhaps that injection is influencing a seismic slip initially, particularly near the wellbore, and that aseismic slip could propagate both spatially or stress to the point where it reaches a seismogenic area of the fault, and then seismicity can occur on there. All right, just a couple of other areas of interest, other interpretations and areas of future work. One of those is we've noticed some unusual frequency magnitude distributions. Some cases where B values are in excess of 1.5. So trying to better understand what's causing that has been an area of interest. We've also noted geologic susceptibility of certain areas that are more likely to have hydraulic fracture-induced seismicity, and trying to understand what are some of the reasons why that's occurring. We've also noted efforts to improve operational controls, forecasting methods, and ways to mitigate, particularly in real time. So those are certainly an area of future work. We also tried to collect information on what has been effective in terms of regulation and traffic light protocols. Certainly some positive influence on reducing hydraulic fracturing-induced seismicity from some of the regulation techniques. Okay, so I just wanted to end with another plug for our paper that, again, if some of the stuff you've seen here is of interest to you, I'd encourage you to have a look at our review paper to learn a little bit more about the details of this topic. Thanks.